concerning a very broadly defined topic of starting and running a healthy, collaborative, open project, mostly focusing on software, but not only. Because soon you'll discover that doing things together is much better, and as soon as you start doing things open, you start interacting with people you never met in person. So we're going to cover a broad range of topics, and the format is very simple. Each of us, each of the speakers will present very briefly the topic and their opinions, and then we're going to jump into the end of the discussion and switch to the key topic. So without further ado, everyone knows Kirstie by now, and Kirstie is going to tell us about how to begin.
Yeah. Let's stand up. No, it's okay. Yes, so Chris put this panel together before he knew that I was giving a talk that was like basically all about running a project, and so a lot of my opinions were mentioned on Monday afternoon about thinking very carefully about who your contributors are and what they can contribute. And I think one of my big sort of guiding principles is trying to consider diversity in the contributions themselves. So there will be some people who can contribute in lots and lots of different ways and are really, really valuable. There might be one person who can just contribute in one particular way, but if it's a way that you don't have the skill, if it's a very distinct skill set, it's just monstrously useful. And a lot of what I was talking about on Monday around having a really great README file so that you really lower the barriers of somebody coming along, finding out about the project, seeing what needs to be done, and helping. So you sort of make it so that if they've had a moment of wanting to help this project that they've heard about in a talk or on Twitter or in some blog post or something like that, that you try and make it just really, really easy for them to make their contribution. I'll tell you about my first contributor to a project called STEM Role Models, which was a database for promoting traditionally underrepresented people in science, technology, engineering, maths, and medicine. STEM. It was this guy, bless him, who was in India and was very enthusiastic. Didn't really know what exactly he was enthusiastic about, but really wanted to take part. And I found his sort of, he would chat in the Gitter channel, or he would respond to issues, and one of the big things that he would say is, tell me what I need to do and I'll do it. And my project was really very young, and actually what I really needed was some pretty high level design thinking, some real sort of like, what are we trying to achieve with this? What do we need to do? When somebody said you should have a web framework, make a database, I was like, I don't know what those things are. Like, I don't know how to do these things. I needed people who were going to come in and really contribute to some of the design of the project. And a little bit around, marketing, letting people know about it, getting some feedback, and some of those things that I had a bit more kind of visibility on. And so having someone swing by those issues and say, tell me what to do, and I'll do it, is really not very helpful. And so he would also sometimes put in pull requests that weren't very clear what he was trying to do. He didn't really do the thing that I had imagined. I'm basically making this sound really terrible. And then the final thing that was really difficult for me, getting my first contributor, was that he expected me to respond to his comments on the issues, or merge his pull requests, review his pull requests, like right now. And he was in India, I was in the UK, so they were ahead of the time. So I'd sometimes get the reminder like within the morning of me waking up and seeing this happen. And so what I did was I edited those contributing guidelines to be very explicit about sort of timelines of expected reviews. So it's said in the contributing guidelines, Kirstie is a postdoc, this is the side project, she's not paid to work on it. She commits to spending 2 hours on it every Monday. So if you have gone a week and you haven't received any response back, you should ping her again. There's like a good chance that she's, missed it or she's forgotten or whatever. But wait until that happens. Wait until you've sort of got to that 1 week kind of barrier. And that was really, really helpful. Because what that meant was that instead of me feeling sort of super anxious when I would get it, wasn't just him, it was other contributors as well, wanting to contribute, having a lot of passion, but needing some support from me as well. It meant that I could ping them the link to that specific part and say, thank you so much, I really appreciate it, I'm going to get back to you on this. And the other thing that I learned from that one particular contributor, and it was pretty interesting, I've spoken with more people going forwards, I think I had a pretty difficult contributor as my very first one. But I also learned that it takes quite a lot of sort of, a little bit of confidence, a little bit of a cold hard heart to put up appropriate boundaries around both what you are willing to do for the project and also what you want the project to be. So I've had other contributors who have come in and been very passionate and very useful, but they wanted to sort of merge it off in a different direction, which has happened with other projects since then. And that is, there's also a lot of introspection for you as the leader to do, and potentially to engage with a smaller group of kind of core contributors to say, if somebody comes up with an issue or wants something, wants to add a feature or wants to do something differently, and it's not really a high priority for you, or it's not what you want to do, I think Gael's going to talk about this in a lot more detail, you can say that's not within the scope of this project. And there's a really interesting balance I found, and I don't have the answer to it, but it's important to know about, of you want people to know about the project, otherwise it's just this like, URL that no one visits. But it's also still something that you need to nurture. And so you want to be able to tell people, you want to be able to guide people to help you if they're there, but you don't necessarily need to acquiesce to anything that anyone says. And then I'll just finish very briefly because I feel like that was very negative story. I will say that the art of writing a really good issue that says, this is the problem, this is the thing that I'm trying to achieve, this is, this is the way I want the world to be, this is what I want this website to look like, this is what I want this function to do. If you can write that really well and share that with your network, someone will come along and just fix it. And you're like, geez, man, that's amazing, thank you. So there are, it goes in both directions, and you can get these like really magical contributors that come along and are awesome. But your very first one, don't let them sort of roll over you too much.
Hey, thank you so much for the story and the advice. So before we open to the audience, the very early stages of the project and getting that the first contributor and second from that.
Maybe something. I tend to use that in the early stages of the project. Stealth mode does not mean hidden, but it means I don't advertise. I progressively advertise the project. Because as I move forward, I find that my understanding and my vision. So you mentioned basically project vision. That's really important to communicate the project vision. My understanding and my vision of the project basically evolves. And so, I don't start a project by trying to get as many contributors as possible. I start the project by trying to get things right, open, of course, and in clear view, but not reaching out to people. The reaching out goes later.
Can I actually say something that I meant to mention, that you don't have to have contributors to your projects. So you can say in the README file, I have made this code available, but I am not accepting contributors to it. you don't have to maintain a project. You don't have, or you might maintain it, but you don't need to continuously develop it. So,
But you can even disable pull requests if they're not pull.
yeah, and I think you can also just say, and I stalked you on Twitter, I know that it doesn't always work out with lots of people being very sort of friendly and kind about it, but it is also fine, this is what I would sort of say to you, is that if you have a project where you don't yet want lots of contributors, you can either mark it as such in the README file or in the contributing guidelines. And if you have a project that is no longer accepting contributors, you can also mark that. And then there's a little bit of this like cold hard heart of if someone comes along asking you to say, that's not where I'm able to expend my energies at the moment. There is only one of you, and we'll talk, I think, about scaling projects, and that's something that should be really magical, but in the end, there is only 24 hours in a day. There is only one of you. You do have to sleep, like, I have to sleep like quite a lot, actually. You have to eat, you have to do a bunch of other stuff. It's fine to say no to people.
And on that topic of the project doesn't have to accept any contributions, I believe that's actually in science the default. Like when a lot of people asked or made to put their code on GitHub, but actually without any intention of contributing. And I feel like outside of this wonderful bubble of openness, sharing, and collaborating, most people assume that this is your project and it's none of my business to actually contribute to it and tell how it should be shaped. So the very minimum is to actually make it clear that if you actually decide to, that you would like to have these contributions. Because a lot of people actually are assuming.
I think the other thing that I'd just add to that is the social side of projects. I think in a lot of things we think about the technical side, the software, the code, but each of these things have a significant social component as well. And getting out of stealth mode, one of the things is what are the use cases that people are doing. Some projects speak for themselves because it's almost a finished thing, but in many cases you write things which are in a process of development. And that requires interactions with people. So part of whether it's sleeping or not sleeping, we'll have to discuss that a little bit, is engaging users in those early stages. And this is a phrase I learned from somebody at the Allen Institute. You should undersell and overperform. We tend to have the opposite thing. We oversell and underperform. And that's something I think, again, is quite useful for a project that's beginning. And I think Gael is going to talk a little bit more about kind of the constraint space around it.
Well, I completely agree with the underselling and overperforming.
I'm really good in the latter.
How do you reconcile that with the incentive structures in academia?
Well, that's a whole talking.
Should we do like a whole other panel discussion on that?
I think it's possible, but it's a long-term strategy. I mean, something that's not clearly visible in the incentive structure of academia is that your reputation is your currency. And long-term, if you have the reputation, that's true for papers too. Long-term, if you have the reputation of being extremely reliable, that's going to help you a lot. Now, unfortunately, and that's really about academia, not about software, high-impact journals are all about overselling and underperforming. And I hate with a passion high-impact journals. And I actually tend not to publish in them because I don't go through, because I submit my paper in it and they're like, oh, but somebody already did it. No, that person didn't do anything, it doesn't work, sorry. But it's okay. I mean, I found that I could have an academic life without doing this. In terms of grant writing, there's a bit of this. Grant writing is a bit about overselling, but first I started accepting it. And then second, I try to have a path in my grant where the whole grant is an oversell, but not everything is an overselling it.
Right.
And that's what I call high risk, high gain versus low risk, lesser gain.
Maybe we can take a few questions from you guys.
So I know that building a community is connections is so important. Can one or several of you talk about the importance of Twitter, sort of in the academic sense?
Well,
I currently don't have Twitter, but I keep being told you need a Twitter, you need a Twitter. How important is that to getting sort of in sort of this scope?
I think Tal should answer that question.
You guys are the panel. Why don't you give your opinions and I'll let you know that's wrong.
So,
And then we'll go back and forth and back and forth. And, yeah.
many of us are here when Twitter did not exist, and life was still fine, and we did build
That might have been a
communities.
bit.
So I think yes, it's a modern trend of how communication may work, but it's a very different form of communication. Does it provide exposure? I think so. Is it a form of getting to know other things out there? Yes. But is it the only way you can build a community? No.
The point-
is important though, or like as
What?
we continue moving forward.
What's important is to engage with people. If you're doing stuff and not engaging with people, you're just going to be alone, and you got to think about why are you even doing this. So it's really important to engage with people. What I find nice about Twitter is it's really good at dealing with an anisotropic ratio of number of people you engage with volume you get in return. So email is terrible for this, even with mailing lists. My mailbox is a disaster. On Twitter, I can follow very few people, and I can very easily decide to not reply to something. It's socially accepted, which is extremely important for me. Doesn't mean I never reply, by the way.
I'll say that for me, so I joined Twitter in grad school. I don't think I tweeted. I don't think I actually did anything on Twitter apart from listening, reading, for quite a few years. And I think that's a really great way of engaging with Twitter. I think just sort of being there, it's a directed graph, right? Which is not like a lot of other social networks. And I think it's very similarly, you can follow a lot of people and you don't have to put any content out there. And then I think you can put content out, and now I tweet a lot. But I think it builds quite a lot of sort of shallow connections. I don't think it builds particularly deep connections. So it might be a good way to keep a sort of gestalt kind of vibe of what's going on. And you can definitely tell people about events that you're running, or I'll sometimes tweet an issue that I've written to try and see if someone will come and fix something. But actually, the deeper your communities are, and the more sort of the bonds that you can make in a less transient space, are really where you will get valuable contributors to your projects. So I think Twitter is pretty surfacey.
Maybe that would be the last one before Gael will kick in.
So as the certifiable oldest person in the group, in answer to your question, if you want to reach your program officers, the people who are on your tenure committee, the folks who are going to evaluate your grants, Twitter is zero important. It's nothing. And
I can speak against that. I had a grant officer actually sending me a direct message on Twitter.
It's changing.
It is changing.
Yeah, it's changing, of course, but Twitter's a flash in the pan. It's a couple years old. It will last a couple years, and the real form of human communication is human communication.
I love human communication, and I think it can take many different shapes.
Yeah.
So our next speaker is Gael.
I prepared slides. Do you want me to try to?
Let's do.
Yeah, I know. Okay, let me rephrase this. I recycled slides. That is a more accurate. Yeah, I thought. So we can, while this turns on, we can continue this discussion on Twitter. I have, Fernando probably has more followers than me, but I have 10,000 followers. Twitter is efficient to communicate in an isotropic way.
It's good.
And some of them, amongst these followers, some of them are very important people.
I'll just say one more thing about Twitter. I felt very lonely in grad school. I felt very much like I was the only person that cared about doing things differently and blah, 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 blah. And Twitter, and I still feel that way. Obviously not these 2 weeks, but I do feel that way an awful lot. And Twitter is often a nightmare and makes me very stressed. But actually, one of the best things that I get from it is feeling that I'm not alone, that there are other people, and it's wonderful to see senior and successful people also caring about the same sorts of things. So that's another little kind of, if you're a bit more junior, if you were anything like me in grad school, seeing some pretty cool people that you look up to saying things about how you would like the world to look, I find it quite inspirational. I still do.
Since I was mentioned, I have to say I have a very conflicted relationship with Twitter, because I do find it very useful as a way of capturing information. I think it also has given a voice to things, issues, and people who didn't have a voice, and that's extremely important. And definitely kind of the broadcast aspect of it, of easily blasting to a lot of people, has value, kind of as an advertising medium, if you will. But I'm very worried about both the shallowness of that Kirstie was referring to, and I think of it as this kind of frictionless spotlight that can turn, where the attention on an issue can turn with 100,000 beams at one moment, completely overwhelm you, leave you stressed out, in a panic, whatever, right? And then it moves over, and it's a mode of communication that is very different from what our actual human cognitive and emotional resources as human beings can handle, right? We don't normally handle communicating with or against 100,000 people in our normal environments, and I find that dangerous and toxic and problematic enough that I've actually mostly withdrawn from using Twitter. I haven't deleted my Twitter account, but if you actually look at my Twitter feed, I haven't basically used it almost at all for the last few months, because I find it very problematic, and the potential downside, if you think of it kind of in a minimax mindset, the potential downside of it so problematic and dangerous that I've mostly withdrawn from it, despite recognizing that it certainly has value and does things that we couldn't do before. I've mostly stopped using it. I've even stopped reading Twitter almost completely. So maybe a bit of an unpopular opinion, but I'm very concerned about it.
It's very short.
I was just curious how many people found out about this or about the benefits of this.
Good question.
It's a good broadcast tool for sure.
Yeah.
Thank you. So I'd like to talk about project scope and tools. And before I get into this, those slides are mostly for me to keep on track. Just to legitimate, I hate bragging openly, but just to legitimate what I'm going to be talking about, I just want to mention that I've been involved in software projects for quite a while. I'm getting old. On different things, with very different scope. And so I've been involved in software projects before this, but these are fairly major software projects that have all been used by many people that all touch on different challenges. And I think you learn a lot when you work with different people on different challenges. So really, if I need to summarize my messages, there are two aspects. It's about choosing the right battles. And so it's really about choosing where to innovate. That's something very, very important. So you can't fight all the battles in one project, and you can't fight all the battles in one life. And then the second aspect is how to win those battles. And with insight on software production is mostly about managing complexity. It doesn't start like this, it grows like this really fast. And that's going to be the case if, I guess, not only software production, but a lot of research. So simplicity is undervalued. It's undervalued in science. It's undervalued in software. And so I really like this paper. It's a paper in the field of software engineering studies. And so basically, it's using experimental psychology-like techniques on software engineering. This is a field that I find really interesting. And what they've shown here is that if you change a bit the complexity of the requirements of a code base, the complexity of the code base increases much, much faster.
And so it's actually really easily understandable is that if your code base is made of components that don't interact at all, then you can see that the complexity of managing this in your head is reasonably linear. But then it's not one code base, it's multiple code bases. So the point here is that if you're going to increase a bit your requirements, your cost is going to go up very, very fast. So my rule, and I was actually taught this rule when I was working in a software startup by my boss, which it's really worry about the 2080 use case. So 20% of the use cases can be solved with, 80% of the use cases can be solved with 20% of the lines of code, right? And the challenge then is identifying those 80%. And that's where the project vision comes in, because you need to have the right vision to say, this is the problem set I want to solve, so these are the 80% use cases that interest me. And this will also require you saying no. For a long time in scikit-learn, I had the impression that my main contribution to the project was me saying no. No all the time. Now I don't even have to, everybody says no. I mean, basically the vision of the project is clear enough that it's people know what's in the limit of the project and what's not. And so there's this quote that's really important by Brian Kernighan. For those who don't know, Brian Kernighan was one of the inventors of C and of the original Unix. So he's an extremely good programmer, better than most people. And he says that debugging is twice as hard as writing the code in the first place. So if you write the code as cleverly as possible, by definition, you're not smart enough to debug it. And that is very, 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 very true. Just something to keep in mind. The goal of this slide is really to stress that simplicity is good. And even though science pushes you to do crazy complex things, that is not scalable and not maintainable in the long term. So then, once we've said this, we want to have a project vision, which is we want to define what the scope of the project is. And so, for instance, if I'm interested in neuroimaging and the kind of stuff I do, I might be interested in doing a software that does machine learning, neuroimaging, has a graphical user interface, and does 3D plotting, all in one software. And I want to start, one day and put all this in a software. That won't work. Why? Because this software will be just too complex. It's not viable to do all this in the same software. Even though my goal may be this, it won't work. It's just not viable. So, as we mentioned, we need a project vision, and I think that it's about breaking down projects by expertise, okay? It's not the same people who are going to be good at 3D plotting and as brain image analysis. And maybe I and a few others have this skill set, but not that many, have both of these skill sets, but not that many. So I also claim that we shouldn't solve hard problems in sustainable software. That's an opinion. It's worked out well. And also I claim, that's a very unpopular opinion in science, but I claim that we shouldn't target markets that will not yield contributors. Because we're simply not going to be able to develop a software if we target markets that don't yield contributors. So this means that not everything qualifies for a software project. So we really need a vision, so an elevator pitch. And your research, whether it's your PhD topic or what I do in my lab, probably doesn't qualify, which probably means that your research will not become a software project. If that's not the case, if your research becomes a sustainable software project, congratulations, you've done the 0.1% of research that qualifies. And that's pretty amazing, by the way. I don't think I've ever done this. So I claim that if you want to do software, you should work with the community because it's going to bring you further. Because you're just not going to be able to hold the software by yourself in the long term. So there you need to find the right trade-offs, and it's about managing complexity. So it's about first limiting the barrier to contribution. So you want easy build, easy development. But it's also about how many people can understand the whole code base. So there's this notion in open source of bus factor. It's a slightly sick notion because the bus factor is the number of people that need to be run over by a bus for your project to fail, the project to be. And so basically how many people are critical to the software. And if one person is the only person who knows and understands the whole code base and understands the whole concepts required behind the code base, that is not a viable project, because that person will eventually, become a PI and not be able to do anything in the project or something like this. This tells us that I believe we need to limit the technicality. And I believe that sometimes we need to take suboptimal choices, even though we are qualified enough to do something complex. We just decide, no, we're just going to go for the simple one. It's okay. So, my messages were about choosing your battle, so choosing what the vision is, where you want to make a difference, and managing complexity. And I think now we should open this to discussion.
Thank you so much, Gael. So that was on the topic of scope and complexity. And maybe this time we can actually open with the audience questions, because I feel like the discussions are going to flow naturally. Scope.
I have a question that, because I really like to look at slides. And the point on there that gave me the most sort of like, oh, I've never thought about that, is this point about like your PhD project. Just like, sucks to be you, not sucks to be you, this is just a truth about the world, it's not going to be a software project. So I suppose I would say that there are projects that you can run as open and collaborative projects that are like training wheels, that you can still run them in an open and collaborative way, you can still develop them without them actually having to have the scope and the impact of, any of your three. I know you've done multiple, but I'm thinking slightly, but how do you feel about that? Like, is it possible to sort of, so long as you're not kidding yourself that you're building the next Jupyter, Scikit-learn, NiPipe?
I feel that's fine. I feel there's a difference between a research project and a tool that you're going to give to people. Research, not science, research. So I call research the academic dance, and I call science the progress of knowledge. There's a difference between the two. So research is about impressing people that you can do hard things. That's really bad for software, because by construction you build things that are too complex. It's fine for understanding things. So basically the way I deal with my academic life is I do complex things and I publish them. And so for instance on machine learning applied to brain imaging. And after doing all this, and after a few years of doing this on the topic, I understand the trade-offs. I understand what can be done simply to solve the problems. And the really cool thing that I'm not doing enough is publishing a review paper that says, I was doing all these very complicated things that can be done simply. Once we have this understanding, we can do a software project. And in academia, it would be the difference between a paper and a textbook. Software projects are like textbook, and you can have shared code that is not a software project. That's fine.
What about,
Wasn't your point a little
So-
bit more about, sorry.
Yeah, I guess I see that, I do understand the distinctions, but if you wanted to, and maybe Satra, if you want to jump in, and Fernando as well, if you wanted to do what most of us go around and give talks about, which is make your paper reproducible, you don't need your paper to be a software project. But I would argue that you should put your code up on GitHub, and that it should be something that people can access and potentially contribute to. So, do you see it? Maybe I'm not making sense.
So I think both of you are kind of agreeing with each other,
Yeah.
really, that everything doesn't need to be a software project. And I think this is the semantics of what a software project is. He's saying a PhD doesn't need to be a software project, but you can indeed put your code up on GitHub. So I think there has to be a notion of what am I communicating through a project, and that does not mean I'm creating a tool or an infrastructure or software for other people to use. I'm communicating my ideas through the code that I've put up over there. if you want to call it a properly software engineered piece of code for reproducible research, we'll talk about it for 3 hours in an hour.
Yeah, like,
But
stay tuned.
But I think the goal of sharing that piece of whether it's code, text, document is something one should evaluate as much as possible. And I do think being open is good for the field in general. But taking on software projects, as in to solve a problem, that's really an engineering thing, right? So it's not about research, to me. And I agree with Gael. I think we often tend to use software projects as vehicles through which we do research and try to put everything into it often, and that's not a good way to deal with a software project. A software has to work. To me, that's an engineering problem. I mean, if you go to a hospital and a device doesn't work, that's no good. That's a bad software or hardware.
The only thing where I would disagree is you said, and you might want people to contribute. The minute so ideally, we should be able to put our code online and it's with absolutely no guarantee, because I personally think that the reproducible research field has had a very, very bad message, a very unrealistic message that people will just put code online and things are going to go fine and it's going to work. That is completely untrue. People are going to put code online and they're not going to work. People are going to download it, doesn't work on my computer. Code, if you download code, it doesn't work. I guess it's been your experience. So the best thing you can do is put a Docker instance that's basically like deep freezing a computer, and that works. Maybe, because even Docker instances stop working a few years after. So if your point is, oh, out of transparency, here is my code, and you can look at it, but no promises it will even run, then it's okay. But oh, maybe we're going to collaborate. Then you start to need to think about scope. Where's the limit? What am I going to start chilling from this code as time goes on?
I think the other,
Sorry, there was a question
Yeah.
from the Yakman over there.
Well, I just wanted to comment on the same issue. I think it's really important to make it clear that research does not translate into a good software project, right? But I also think if you're starting out, a lot of the stuff is new. You don't really know. Your vision for software comes with a lot of experience. I think it's perfectly fine to say, look, I'm going to take my research project, I'm going to clean it up a little, I'm going to try to organize it in a way that makes sense, I'm going to put it online. Something that looks like a software package. I think the critical thing is to be okay with the possibility nobody will use it and then people will find this not well organized. But that I think is actually a very useful thing to do, because you will learn from your own mistakes, right? You'll see, hey, no one's using this. You might say, well, that's because it's not well organized, the API kind of sucks. And so I don't think we want to discourage people. It's not like, either you're going to spend like 6 months of your life thinking about this as a software project, or I'm going to do research and not worry about putting it online. It's the expectations that you have to manage. Right? Don't expect to take your PhD project, just stick it up online, do like half an hour's work, and expect a whole bunch of people to show up and use it. Right? As long as you kind of know what the expectations are, I think it's reasonable to say, here's sort of a toy project. It could turn into something if there's sort of good feedback, but I'm not expecting that to happen.
I also think there's quite a tough dichotomy. So I agree with everything that Tal said, and I think there's quite a tough sort of message of putting such a firm distinction between research and an engineering project, because I think that basically means the message that, I don't know if you mean to say this message, but what I can hear is stay in your lane. Like, don't sort of come over to contributing to software projects if you are just a researcher. And I think that's reasonably productive, but I do think that's what I personally hear from those messages, and I think it's quite a sort of...
That's not what I mean.
I know, I believe you.
I've never had training in software at all in my whole life, in programming or anything.
So what would be your path, for both of you, what would be that path to sort of... Because what I was trying to sort of suggest was something much closer to what Tal articulated, is like, you give it a whack, no one uses it. Oh well, it was, at least you tried. What would be your sort of pathway for people who were doing a PhD, who are paid to do research, but who care about contributing to software?
Should I segue into what
Maybe.
I'm going to talk about?
Yeah, let's do that.
I mean, maybe, Gael, do you want to say anything?
Maybe,
And then you can totally...
yeah.
Yeah.
I find I'm much more efficient to produce software that's useful for me. So that's how I do it, and that is, but yeah, I mean, my computer science papers mostly don't turn into software. I'd like them to, by the way. I think what I'm doing is useful. It's just I don't have the budget for this. Budget of my time, budget to pay people. It's just not happening. This is where I'm saying that the reproducible science community is giving an incomplete message, is we will not have the budget to make everything reproducible. I'd like this to be the case. And maybe we should change the way we do science and publish less, but that's currently a fact.
I don't know why it has to be all or nothing, I guess. Like, I have looked at software that does not work and seen what it's trying to do. What are you getting at here? It doesn't run my machine, but I can glean enough from this big progress on the problem I'm working on now. And I think there's a lot of value to that, even if it's a broken product.
Sure. So that's all about managing expectations.
Yeah, I totally agree. It's not the...
But by the way, managing expectation doesn't work. You will get hate mail. And I'm really bad at accepting this.
Satra.
All right, so I'm going to segue from Kirstie's question. I was going to talk about contributing to other projects. And since Nate is over here, one of the things that I've done in the past is used a little script that Nate wrote a long time back, which allowed you to basically play with stats. It was a little interactive drawing tool which would show regression lines on plots and other things, and you could pick outliers and drop them out, and you could see the p-value change, and you could play with it, right? And it was a clever interactive tool. All you needed was a CSV file to drop into it. And I think that kind of brings about the fact that I like to see other people's code because it's very educational. It helps me understand bugs and other things that are there. And I have no problem contributing to other people's projects. In fact, I think I've contributed to most people's projects over here on this panel. And I think that brings about a set of experience. I was walking by our physicist desk and he had Niels Bohr's statement out there that an expert is someone who knows all the bugs in a very narrow domain. And I think that's true. Experience is about being able to identify problems with software, and that you get by talking to people, contributing to other projects, and throughout at least, I mean, it's funny that 3 of us are sitting over here, sorry for you guys, but my open source world started with these guys at Berkeley about 10 years back. And it has changed everything. So I think in terms of connections that we have built over the years, the human side of contributing to other people's projects is equally as important as developing your own project. And you get to see the social interactions that take place in other people's projects, and I think that also teaches. So I think of life and everything as a teaching signal. My brain may not interpret it properly all the time, but I think that's what I see as the importance of relating to other projects. And part of the reason why I think NiPipe is where it is today is because, not because of the people who've contributed to NiPipe, but all the other projects surrounding it, and the notion of an ecosystem, and the notion of little projects in this ecosystem that can coexist and work together. I'm a big fan of decentralization. Those who know me know that. And I think there's something about the scalability of little projects as opposed to really giant monolithic projects. And that's something I think comes about when people contribute. And that may help increase the buzz factor a little bit.
Yeah.
Because every time you contribute to another project, you have to learn about that project a little bit to be able to contribute to it. In terms of tangible versus intangible benefits that this has applied, I think both exist. So I can tell you tangible benefits. NiPipe is supported by an R01, and that has come about because of contributions and other people using the tool, right? So direct supporting for a software project has come about. The intangible benefits, I've made tons of friends over the years, and that continues, and we can talk about everything other than software. We can argue about things that should not be going into a project, and we can live life kind of with a fun thing. So Gael knows this. But I think it's so important that you appreciate the work that other people are doing, and one way to do this is to try and contribute to other people's projects. It'll help your work, and it'll help them.
I can only echo the fact that the sense of community is probably the most valuable thing. It's something that's really worth investing into. And this has nothing to do with bits, bytes, and lines of code. It's about being a human and understanding other humans, understanding their perspective. And I've been running on this different projects and starting new ones and whatnot. And recently I had this experience of, I wanted to contribute to pandas. Pandas, you've probably heard about it already, how I was teaching it. I wanted to add like a small thing. I just wanted them to, for files that have an extension .tsv, to like change, use a different separated by default. Or maybe that was change what do they actually accept as a missing value to like add another string. Simple, like I changed literally 3 lines of code, and that pull request took around 2 months to be merged because I changed it. Then they told me I have to change it in 1 more place. I changed it 1 more place. Then they merge in between another pull request, and I have to rebase. And all of their replies were very very brief, very sort of like to the point, just like, hey, what about my feelings? And I just like realized, it gave me this like this mirror was like put in front of me, and I was like, well, this is how I sound when I'm stressed out dealing with like many different pull requests and whatnot. And it's really hard to have this capacity of doing that. But I think it's also important sometimes it's better to not give a response than give a response that will put someone off. And maybe that's the testament to handling some flow of information.
And maybe I'll just add one more thing that over the years I've given many talks. In a lot of those talks, a lot of things I've done are talking about other people's software. And I think that's actually quite important in growing that ecosystem and in creating a community where you understand what the expectations are in terms of contributions and non-contributions.
Do you have any questions on this topic, building communities? Sir?
Yeah, I'd like to sort of reverse this from the other side. So let's say there's a project. I like this project, I use it, I'd like to become a contributor. What are the sort of first few steps that I should make to become a contributor?
So I think it really depends what the situation is of the project in its life cycle. We just heard that contributing to a major project that has hundreds of thousands of users and developers just drowning in email is hard because developers are not giving a lot of feedback and because they've built basically a wall of rules that you need to comply to contribute to the project. Now, so contributing to a major project is hard and may not be the best way to start your career as a contributor. You may want to contribute to a project that's less visible. The advice I'd give you overall for software contributions is contribute things that are useful for you. There's no better fuel than solving a problem that matters to you. That's crucial. You'll do it well. And then the other thing is you also want this to be, ideally you also want this to be useful to the other person, to the development team. So it all goes back to project vision. Same thing, you'll get great feedback when the development team is excited about the contribution. So if you really want to contribute for the sake of it, try to figure out what's exciting for people. But be in your comfort zone. And so if you have no comfort zone, like you don't know software development, well then maybe it's the time to not do software and to do an open project that doesn't want to be a software, just wants to be an open project, with the difference that I make between open projects and software.
And let's not forget documentation, tutorials, and all of the non-coding stuff that's super important.
So giving talks about, one way of contributing to a project is to give a talk about it. That's awesome. We're just so happy when people give talks about our project because we're overwhelmed with things to do. Contributions are also awesome and very useful because not every software developer is very didactic. And not every person who's very didactic is a great software developer. So we need different people.
Fernando, what's your view on like how do people contribute to Jupyter? I mean, it's such a big project. What would be your answer?
Yeah, Jupyter is that actually it's a good segue into. I was asked to talk about delegation.
Oh yeah, sorry.
Which actually is a question that is, I think, different for a project like Jupyter than most others, because Jupyter is a project with spectacularly complex scope, in the sense that it has grown from one single tool, originally IPython, into something that today spans, I think, 6. We can't fit in a GitHub organization anymore. We literally can't fit in a GitHub org because the management is too complicated. So we have, I think, six, I believe, GitHub orgs, each of which has many, many repos. I think there's about order 120 active repos in there, with multiple teams broken up over all of that. No one in this room should be thinking about doing something like that. First of all, let me be very, very clear.
And you were not when you started it?
Yeah.
I was not when I started. I was solving my problem. I was solving a strictly personal problem of n equals 1. One student avoiding looking at his PhD. That was exactly what I was doing. And it's okay not to grow to that scope, right? It's completely okay. And in fact, I doubt very many projects will grow to that scope, because also part of the growth of Jupyter was that it hit a peculiar point in time in the evolution of scientific computing and in the stack of what things are needed. And it filled a certain need, and maybe we did a decent job with it and it has been helpful, but I don't think there are many other ways of filling that particular niche. I'm not saying there will be no other large projects, but of that flavor, it's not that easy to grow to that scope. And so some of the things that come from my perspective are really, really different. And that's completely okay. You should never be thinking that that is the definition of a successful project, because a successful project is something that A, solves your problem. That's the very first thing. And if you do want it to become an open community project and not simply something that is solving your problem, then that serves a community, but that community may very well be a fairly small one. In terms of the question about how to delegate when you grow, because yes, for us that's particularly complicated at the scope that we are today, but it does apply to every project. I think there's kind of 2 directions that I want to emphasize. And the first one has actually already, Kirstie made a number of very good points in that direction already, which is about clarity and explicitness, for example, in setting boundaries in your README, and whether you say that even that you don't want contributors, or things of that nature. When you think about delegation of responsibility for growth, it's very important that you make explicit and document, as you were telling your story with the Monday cycle thing, right? That you tell people what the processes are for decision making, for who can become part of the project and how, and that you make it particularly explicit 2 things. One is how to grow in a project, sort of, okay, well, if I contribute, how does a different level of decision making get reached? How do people kind of step through? Actually, in Jupyter, some of what I'm saying is do as I say, not as I do, because even we are figuring out how to be better at this, how to be more explicit and whatnot. So some things I'm saying, we even don't do them quite right, but we're learning how important it is to do them, partly because of what people even within our organization say. So how does someone kind of grow through the stages of a project? And B, how are decisions made? And be explicit about that. At the beginning, in an early project, well, how do you make the decisions? I don't know, I just look at stuff and I make a decision, I think about it. That doesn't work when you start delegating. You need to be clear about how decisions are made, and in particular, how conflicts, and not in the sense of conflict in a kind of code of conduct sense, but just conflict of disagreement about how do you make decisions when people disagree? How do you avoid deadlocks? If 2 people really disagree on a technical decision, how do you avoid deadlocking a project, right, from the human sense? And so being explicit and clear and deliberate and intentional about that, and reaching consensus within your community. You can look at what other projects do, but not every community needs to make decisions in the same way. You need to find what works for you and the people you work with, right? And second, in a different direction, is as you bring new people, as you begin delegating responsibility, you really need to be careful and intentional about the notion that what you're trying to do is empowering others to work. And that actually means, and this is tough to do early on, especially when it's your little thing, it's your baby, you kind of grew it out, is you need to take a really strong step back in allowing others to make decisions that you might disagree with. You might even be convinced that they are wrong. And obviously there's a balance. I mean, if they're really doing something which is a disaster, you want to say, hey, wait a minute, that's not right. But sometimes you do need to give them the benefit of the doubt, because if you don't allow people to make some decisions that are different even from the ones you would have made, you will disempower them. They are not your employees. You are not paying them enough to tell them what to do. You are building a community of peers who you want to be your partners. And if you make people feel completely disempowered, then they'll just simply go away. They won't be motivated to grow with you. They won't bring new ideas. You won't spur their creativity. So it's a fine balance, because it doesn't mean that every random thing that people come up with is fair game, but you need to find that equilibrium where and I've done that very early on back when it was still IPython. There were people doing things, I'm like, I don't think we should do that, but you know what? I'm going to let you run with it, and I'm going to close my eyes, and we'll see where that goes. Because it also turns out that sometimes they were right, and you were wrong. And so it's a bit of an art, but it's important that you do that if you really want to get the best out of people. Because that's how you get people who turn out to be way better than you, way more energetic than you, growing things in ways that you probably wouldn't have thought of or couldn't have done. And it's a very tough personal thing in the earlier phases of a project, and as Kirstie said, it's not something you have to do. You can say, I'm not even accepting contributions. But since the question for me was about delegation and growth, this is a lesson that I've kind of learned over time. I'm not perfect at it. I make my own mistakes. I'm stubborn as well. But it is important that you keep this in mind if you genuinely want to grow a community where others feel equals to you and not simply under you.
Wow, that's great.
Do we have to? I told you we have to go.
Yeah, another two.
Oh, good. Oh, that's good.
Any questions, comments to Fernando? I can only echo this. It's that feeling of I don't agree with some direction, but if I want this project, even at the smallest one, we can talk about the project that very similar to one of the projects that many of you will make next week, when there's going to be 3-4 of you, and you might not agree with each other. Maybe there's going to be one person that proposed an idea, proposed a direction, and other people joining that person. There are going to be disagreements, and if you want that project to really be truly collaborative, and if you really are peers, you need to talk to each other. And often there is this internal voice telling you that this is a bad idea, we shouldn't do this. But you have to overcome it and see where it goes. And as you said, we are wrong all the time. And just we should acknowledge that and allow ourselves to be wrong and correct it. So and that's, I see, you might think that this is totally unrelated to any scientific endeavors, but I think a lot of what we are hearing about right now will make much more sense next week when we're going to start working together on those projects, and many of those projects will live on throughout the years, organizing these hackathons and hackademies and hack weeks. Many of these projects that are quite important and vibrant right now started at this event. Like NeuroHackademy started in a hackathon organized by Gael in Boulder years ago. So these things will definitely come up.
Can I ask you a question of everyone else? So I think the example that you were talking about, Fernando, is like somebody in the collaborative team making a decision to go be like, oh, okay, we'll see where that goes. Have you had, and then I think what you were talking about sort of project vision and project scope. So my question is, if you feel that someone has an idea that is broadening the scope, would you like, how likely is it that you would choose to split the project into two projects, into two different movements, something like that?
I mean, we've done a lot of that. And by the way, what I was saying was in no way counter to the notion that you should have scope, and that sometimes the right answer is no. Like, we're not doing that. And it's especially important when it's a broadening of scope, right? That's a really critical one. There's a kind of a difference between, yes, we're doing this and it's about how we do it, and so we agree that we're going to try to do this and we may disagree on the solution, versus you want to broaden the scope in this direction. That is a hard one, because in most cases, I agree with Gael, the answer should be no, because of all the arguments that were already made. Sometimes the answer may be, okay, that's a good thing to do. It's valuable to grow, and that is an art. If you never grow anything at all, it's likely that the project may have lesser impact, and sometimes it is the right price to pay, but you have to be incredibly careful about it. But you shouldn't be afraid of splitting, and that's often the right answer, is to say, well, actually that is a good new problem. Let's cut it out, and maybe we do it together. It's a new sub-project within our bigger scope, but it allows you to kind of close off those boundaries and diminish the number of interactions that lead to the superlinear growth and complexity. Or maybe it's a good way of saying, hey, that can be its own thing over there, and that's perfectly fine. Today, the barriers for that to happen are so much lower than they used to be, in the sense that the machinery and infrastructure to create and run projects these days is so easy to use, and GitHub and whatnot, that the social cost of telling someone sort of, no, this won't grow here, go do it over there, is much less, right? 15 years ago, it was hard to get an open source project off the ground. It was such a pain in the neck to get the pieces together that you sort of wanted to keep people in. These days, that barrier is very low, so it's easier to tell people, let's cut it off and let's not grow the complexity we have in here. Let's keep that elsewhere. There's a social way of saying that correctly and kindly and in an encouraging way, but that no can actually be a productive no. As a little anecdote in that direction, the best thing I've ever done with IPython was one no that I gave to John Hunter, which led to the birth of Matplotlib. John Hunter sent me an email in 2002 because IPython at the very beginning had plotting in it. Because of course it was 2001, and so IPython had glommed a GNU plot wrapper on top. There was one, and I had wrapped it inside of IPython, and John sends me an email, I didn't know him, and he says, hey, I've added MATLAB style syntax to your GNU plot wrapper in IPython so that I can use IPython with GNU plot instead of MATLAB. Here's a patch. And at that point, I was desperate for actually graduating, and I had had enough problems already that I was like, okay, I had promised my wife and my advisor and my parents that I was going to graduate. So I said, hey, you seem like a really kind person, thank you so much, but I can only look at this in maybe 6 months when I graduate because I'm in real trouble, so thank you so much, but no, I can't do this right now. And John went and said, I'm not waiting 6 months. And thus was born Matplotlib. We eventually became best friends, and the two projects collaborated a lot. Years later, we had a meeting at Berkeley where we actually looked at, and turns out SciPy also had a shell, and it also had plotting. And Matplotlib also had a bunch of numerical functions and had a little shell in it. So we basically sat down and then we said, okay, IPython will do the whole shell stuff, let's move that over here. Let's move the plotting stuff all over into Matplotlib, and let's move the numerical stuff. We even sent functions from IPython into SciPy because they were numerical, or NumPy, they were numerical functions. And then we were able to do that cutting and recarving of responsibilities because it was clearer now what each project should do. So it's kind of a little story in that direction, and it also led to one of my best friends in life.
We've got a question there?
Yeah, so some of those points made me think of 572 and the benevolent dictator's comments after that. So this was some like enhancement to Python that I guess it changes the way you can sign variables and expressions. led to this stepping down or whatever. And so my question is sort of, how do you, apparently you got a lot of hate mail for this, particular pet. And how do you approach sort of, or what are your thoughts about kind of changing the attitude towards open source projects in general? How to have less kind of that spirit, which is just you owe me this, PR, or you owe me this, an immediate response. What do you think about changing that? How the public kind of approaches open source science projects in general?
So the first thing that I do on that topic is I point people to a talk. I can find it again. It's that Brett Cannon has a really nice talk. Brett Cannon is a core Python developer who works very closely with Guido and the core team. He works at Microsoft just up here in Vancouver, and he has a really good talk exactly on that topic. And so it's a good educational, it's a short, really good talk, and it's a good resource to give other people who are not as used to this process to kind of frame that problem, and he goes over kind of the developer side and the community and the impact that those types of communication have. And I think it's probably the best resource that I know to help people with that. It's easy to Google it and find it. He gave it at a PyCon Cascades a year or two ago, and it's an extremely useful resource. On the specific Guido thing, I think there was that was a little different because he got a lot of external, but the internal debate on Python dev was also brutal, I'm actually impressed that he stuck with it to the end. I would have given up earlier than that, and I haven't spoken with him, but my sense watching what happened is that he kind of, it was one of these marathons where he crossed the finish line and then realized he was completely exhausted, right? It's sort of, he pushed himself to get through the finish line, and then he realized, I'm too burnt out. And I think that's fair, and I think it's important to sort of allow people to pull away. I think he's worked on the same thing for 25 years in a very high bandwidth, and it's both intellectually and emotionally very demanding. And so allowing him to say, you know what, you've done more than enough, take a step back, that's fine, and find other ways or other things that are also new and exciting and rewarding to you. It's actually surprising to find someone who's been able to maintain that level of engagement for 25 years on effectively one problem. And so part of building projects, especially as they get larger and live longer, is growing governance structures that allow people to rotate, that allow people to move around. We're looking at that specifically right now in Jupyter. I actually want to move away from this kind of pseudo BDFL type thing, because first of all, it's not realistic, and also because I am also quite burnt out for other reasons. I haven't had anything like PEP 572, but I am quite burnt out for other reasons. And I have other interests as well, and I want other people to contribute in similar ways. I'm not the only one in the project kind of in a leadership role, but obviously I am one of those, and it's important to build into your communities mechanisms of governance that allow for rotation and whatnot. Guido did a terrific job, but I think he put it on himself, and this goes back to things Kirstie was saying, that we tend on these things to kind of take on sort of, I have to do everything roles, and I think he put too large of a load on himself, and I think he paid a price, and that's unfortunate. And I think he has every right to step away. We owe him a huge debt of gratitude, and I think it's important as a lesson to build mechanisms into projects that don't burn people out that badly. Jesse Noller was the chair for PyCon, the conference side, years ago, and he very famously and somewhat publicly flamed out catastrophically after running PyCon for a couple of years and effectively disappeared from the community, as far as I can tell, because basically he kind of threw himself in the front line to a point that was unsustainable. And that's a bad idea. I mean, you're destroying your life, and you're also not contributing further. So building mechanisms of governance that prevent that is very important.
On the other hand, so that's, there are two problems. There's the internal and there's the external. The internal is with your community of developers, of core developers and all this. And the external one is the fact that open source has no visibility in terms of what it does. And to quote a specific example, there was a big bug in OpenSSL a couple of years ago that was known as Heartbleed. To give the context, OpenSSL is a library that's used for security all over the world. For when you connect to your bank, OpenSSL is involved. That's crucial. It was developed by one person who was clearly not paid enough for what he was doing. And so banks and everything is building on this, and nobody is even thinking we need to think about this sustainability. So I don't know how to solve this problem. We need to talk about it, and we need to talk about it really high up. I've had my own problems with scikit-learn, where we got funding cut from one day to the other with no warning. I had people very high up tell me you're not useful, and their own infrastructure was using it, but they were not aware. So there's an awareness problem of two things. One that is that everything runs open source. I've sat next to people who work on defense contracts for France who were claiming that, of course, the missiles, the French missiles were not running open source, and they must, of course, be rewriting the computer vision code because they need a really, really solid code. That's a joke. OpenCV is more solid than anything else, and I'll challenge anybody to have such a code base and closed source. But people can get away with this because it's closed source, so they can say my code base is fantastic. So we have an awareness problem that needs to go very, very high up. With scikit-learn, we've been talking to people that didn't know that their employees were using scikit-learn. Why? Because it's free, because it's easy to install. So the crappy software that they need to pay for, they know that they're using it because they're signing the order sheet. But the free software, they don't know. So we really need to do something about this. I'm not the only one saying this, by the way. More and more people are saying this because it's endangering the sustainability of open source. And these days, sustainability of open source is sustainability of everything. You have open source in everything you do. I don't know how to solve this problem. And I'm not even sure it's the topic of today because we're talking about open science and it's a different topic.
I mean, I think it sort of is. It becomes this So I gave a talk about culture change in academia that I gave a version of it at OHBM, and my answer to one of the questions is that I get up in the morning and I think that I have to fight the patriarchy, white supremacy, and capitalism, and I'm like, I was about to swear, whoa, that's a really big thing for me to do today. And it is this really interesting sort of spiral that when you pull on this one little thread, it expands out to kind of take over all of the things that are wrong in the world. So a lot of the things that I care about is cliques within open source and how do you encourage people to contribute who have traditionally not contributed to projects, because I think that's a really key aspect of sustainability. But I will say, because I think we should talk about Chris's slides because they're really interesting too, your question and the discussions that I've already had this week make me feel so excited for the future. I think I'm really, really glad that people are thinking about these things, because we do need to make some big pitches to governments, to industry, to funders, to the people to do, really recognize. I completely agree with all of that. And then there is this other side of a grassroots kind of responsibility on that the individuals will start to say, I'm going to do the things that I think are right. And I think where codes of conduct can kind of come into play is, instead of letting problems escalate all the way up to red flags and then hate speech and really terrible things, is to have communities self-regulate when they see orange flags or yellow flags, and try and sort of get to a place where we're preventing those sorts of toxic conversations. I know that's maybe a little bit of an aspirational fight patriarchy kind of jam, but I think that's one of the paths forward.
Maybe I can add a little bit to the...
Sorry, Chris.
No, it's good. I'm just standing here.
To the delegation thing. Maybe that's already at a stage where a project is large, somebody has been leading it, but many of you here, probably some of you here might create large projects, but most of you are likely to create a tool that you need for your work, right? what about finding another person who also needs that tool? And if you start building by creating that link at an early stage, where two people may need the same tool, A, you've increased buzz factor instantly, and B, you've created a small micro community. And if you think at that scale, you keep creating communities that interact with each other.
It's like a real decentralization jam. So we
And
should
it's
talk about
fun.
that.
And it's fun.
And it's fun.
Yeah.
That's crucial.
Even in a very small project, actually, especially in a very small project.
Yeah.
But going back to that question, because I think that happens quite a lot, when, especially when you build something very useful, people come in and give you poorly worded feedback. So, yes, often it's like, this is stupid, why are you doing this way, you should add this. Or elements of that, basically. And I think it's really a problem of a perspective. It's really like a theory of mind thing. And when I was talking about, like, when I was contributing to that pandas or TensorFlow with like small bits, I realized what is that other perspective. And I think part of the solution is everyone being a contributor and a maintainer, even of a small project, because then you start seeing that perspective. And I think the other way of dealing with such poorly worded requests is just has a very polite, very patient way of saying, it could be a template even, this is an open source project, this is how can you contribute, we would love you to add this feature. And then instantaneously that person is like, oh wait, I forgot I never paid for this. And
Or said thank you.
Or said thank you,
yeah.
or did anything else. And I think that's a useful way of dealing with such. Because
I just kind of want to bring it back to something that Ariel touched on earlier, which is from the perspective of someone who maybe has not contributed before, maybe like once or twice, so you want to start contributing things. What do all of you see as a good PR from someone who's clearly doing this for the first time or hasn't done much before, versus a bad PR? Like what should people sort of strive for as like, this is the first time I'm going to contribute to this project? What do you look for when you see like, oh, I got a PR from something you don't know and it just shows up?
So something that's very important, I shouldn't stress it too much, is that the smaller the PR, the more likely it is to be useful. Nonlinear complexity, everything. So a good PR, so it shouldn't be trivial. Like it does take a lot of our resources to fix like tiny wording. If a wording mistake in a documentation is really a problem, change it. If a wording mistake in documentation is not, maybe not. So good first PR is a small one. Start small, establish trust, and train yourself. And a good PR is also one where you feel that it's asked for. Like, we know there's an issue on this.
There's an awesome blog post, which I think I linked to in most of my contributing guidelines, but I'll find it and put it in the Slack channel after this, called Don't Push Your Pull Requests. And it basically talks through, like, it's like a help me, help you kind of thing that says, if you want to put in a pull request, open an issue first, describe what you think might be useful, get a little bit of feedback about that first, then follow the guidelines, whatever guidelines there are, depending on the size of the project. Only when the issue is clarified and one of the maintainers has said, sounds good, go for it, then put in your pull request. And that, again, and it should be small, it should be a unit of work, it should be everything that Gael said, but I'll share that blog post because I find it really useful. I would say there is someone who has only contributed once to a pretty large, not as big as Pandas actually, like a pretty large project, and had a very negative experience doing it. I would say contribute to your friends, contribute to each other's projects, even if you're sitting right next to each other and you could just push to master because you're buddies and you're sitting right there. Do the pull request thing with a person that you trust and that you know is particularly sort of wanting to do that, to get a bit of experience about it. Don't jump into
the big
core Python dev, yeah, exactly, or the big projects. That'd be my advice.
So we're almost running out of time. I'm going
Sorry.
to quickly show you a couple of resources and just like one tiny difference. I actually love pull requests for documentation fixing my grammar. So that can be different from project to project. So we talked a lot about empowering people, about building communities, about making sure that everyone feels included and they feel that they are a peer, that they are not being delegated something. This is not that you hire, it's like a gun for hire, and then you tell them what to do, they do it, and you tell them what to do next. And one of the ways to do it, the most natural one, is basically working together on something that you're all passionate about. So that was going back to the advice of like, send a pull request with a feature that you need, that you care about. And that is the biggest, most sustainable motivation. But there's also a very important aspect of crediting everyone, making sure that it's very publicly visible that this is a project that is possible because of collaboration with people. And there are a couple of things, practical things that you can do in your projects to make that happen. So the first one is called all contributors, and this is basically a way of listing different types of contributions to a project. And it's a very cute yet formal way of using emojis to show what different people contributed. And the emphasis here is that the contribution doesn't necessarily have to be a piece of code. There are contributors who, as Gael mentioned, just gave talk about your project, and that's an important contribution. And the idea behind this project is to be able to emphasize this. So you can use their templates and use their emojis to show what sort of different contributions different people did. Maybe they created a piece of art for a logo, maybe they added a talk, maybe they actually fixed a bug or created a text. And we've been using this in bits because even though it's not really purely a software project, we have a lot of contributors which have different types of contributors, including giving talks, including participating in the discussion. That's a very important thing. They give us feedback, they think thoroughly about it. Did they actually write down the end definition of that term? No, but without their discussion, without their feedback, that definition would not be as good. And we also have these traditional things such as like, NIH. Which contributed in a very explicit manner. So I recommend you to check out all contributors and use it in your project. But I also want to mention one more resource, which is more related to the way credit is given in academia. I started using that in NiPipe and then in fMRI Prep, and the idea is that even though you might have published a paper about your tool, that tool will live on, and there will be more people contributing to that tool over the years. And those people, within current publishing system, you cannot add these co-authors to that paper. So what do you do? And the idea here is that you can create automatically a DOI, a citable object, and update it for every release with new authors, which are the new contributors to this project.
Does the DOI change per release?
Yes.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
So
There's two answers to that.
Yes.
There's what they call a concept DOI, which is a static DOI, and then there's a different DOI for every release. So you can use either DOI depending on what you're talking about. If you're talking about fMRI Prep, you talk about the concept DOI. If you're talking about the version of the code that you used.
But I haven't figured out how to actually properly cite the concept. But maybe we can show that later. So maybe, okay, we dove quite a bit into details very quickly, but the idea is that, for example, this is the boilerplate citation thing for fMRI Prep, and you can see here it mentions NiPipe, and it has these two citations. One of them is a paper that was published ages ago, and it has that many authors on it. And those were all the people that contributed at that time. And then we have the citable object for NiPipe for that specific version, and those are all the people that not only contributed but also wanted to be on that publication. And how practically this is done It's basically through an organization called, a project called Zenodo, which is part of CERN, so it has quite a bit of sustainability. And they are minting those DOIs. And here, every version, as you can see here, has a different DOI. And my internet decided to not be there for some reason. I'm just going to do it static. So each version would have a different DOI. And the cool thing is that you can fairly, to a fair extent, automate the whole process. So what you do, you put a JSON file in your repository, and that JSON file has the list of all of the co-authors, including their ORCID IDs optionally. And what you can do in your pull request templates, or when someone new starts contributing to the project, say like, this is great, thank you, we're merging. Could you also add your name to this file? And when Zenodo, then you can configure Zenodo automatically that whenever you push that release button, then Zenodo will automatically create a new DOI for that release, will parse this file, and will create a citation object that would be able to give more academically suitable credit for those contributions. Again,
we should ask GitHub to allow you to keep effectively that card on your profile personally. We should literally ask them for that. If you could keep your basically Zenodo card, the personal one, on your GitHub profile,
so it'd be easier
it would
to
be
add
very easy to collect. Like, oh, for this really, like we have these new Git, because we have the GitHub IDs on the commit log. Just slurp them out of
if
GitHub.
your profile
GitHub
would list what's your ORCID ID and what's your affiliation.
Yeah, if GitHub would let you fill that in somewhere in GitHub, then it would be.
Let's send a pull request to GitHub.
Yeah. Well, we can ask. We can ask.
Go for like the small projects first.
Yeah, we can ask.
Yeah, we should definitely follow
ask
up with that. So that's basically all. The bottom line is you creating a community, and in that community, people should be respected, and their contribution should be credited. And those are two tools that you can use both of them to make sure that those contributions are credited. I'm happy to show you how to set that for your projects next week, for example. You can do it from the very beginning. And Kirstie.
We're over time, I'm really sorry, and I'm asking this question because Michael Notter and I have a pull request open for like months ago, exactly on this. How do you order the authors?
Yeah, so that's
Just do that quickly, yeah.
We have a magical script.
There's an excellent KCV on that.
Yeah.
I think originally we ordered people by a number of comments or something like that. Right now it's a bit more of a stochastic process.
Because that doesn't scale at all with the all contributor thing, which is very important.
Yeah. Also, with all contributors, it's easier. With all contributors, we just have everyone alphabetically.
Yeah.
Yeah, but then...
With the publication, it's a bit more complex, I agree. But that's a topic for Beer 102.
We're using the policy for Jupyter of having project as the first author and alphabetical after that to avoid the metric gamification and commit counts and all that. Project is the lead author, Project Jupyter. A, B, C, D, and yeah, those of us who have late name letters, we're going to be somewhere in there in the middle. That's fine.
But I read on Twitter that middle authors don't get jobs.
Middle authors don't get jobs, man.
Exactly. That's
If you've not been following Twitter, there's like a whole thing going on.
Let's fix the academic incentive structure today.
With one pull request to NIH. Yeah. Yes, exactly. So let me, please join me together with thanking all of the wonderful speakers.
Thanks, Chris, for organizing.
And I know some of this might sound like this is not exactly what I'm doing, but hopefully we're all more relatable next week, and we'll be around with some of us to help you out, figure out these things.
Yeah, and if I can add something to this, a lot of the messages that were for software apply for science too, by the way.
I want to say I'm going to be leaving now for the airport, but I want to thank the organizers for having invited me. All of you doing a terrific job. And I also want to flag two people. I'm sorry, your name? Carolina and Venetia, or you? works with JB, who did, in my talk on Monday, I talked about reproducibility and the modular architecture of Jupyter Lab, and Carolina came yesterday and was already kind of setting up a lot of her workflow with that machinery, and we had a very productive session, and Anisha actually implemented and her team, Nate is here, and others, their team implemented a Nifty viewer for Jupyter Lab, a Nifty plugin, which is now, I believe, kind of, I don't know if it's installable already or not on NPM, but I know you're working on it, but I saw it working. So it was really, really satisfying to see people immediately jumping on getting that work done. So thank you for kind of being so engaging, and I hope to see you all again. Thank you.
Let's do 15 minutes and come back for